peace and security in ASEAN. Today's event is co-hosted by UN Women, National Counter-Terrorism Agency of Indonesia, and Monash Gender Peace and Security Center. We would like to thank the Global Affairs Canada and the Government of the Republic of Korea for making today's event happen, and for their generous contributions to advance the women, peace, and security agenda in the ASEAN region, specifically to this research. Before we begin the session, I would like to inform you that this event will be recorded for documentation purposes and being live streamed on UN Women Asia and the Pacific YouTube channel. Also, all participants are automatically muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A panel at the bottom right. Thank you. And now to start, I would like to invite His Excellency Bapak Komjen Pol Dr. Boy Rafli Amar MH, Head of the National Counter-Terrorism Agency Indonesia, Senior Officials Meeting on Transnational Crime Indonesia, to deliver his welcoming remarks. Pak Boy, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. The Honorable Dan Bryan, Head of Cooperation and Consular Global Affairs Canada, Mr. Jamshed MKZ, Representative and Liaison to ASEAN UN Women Indonesia, Dr. Alexandra Pilan, Deputy Director of the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Center and lecturer in politics and international relations at Monash University. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. Allow me to begin by thanking the representative of the member state of the ASEAN and various civil society organizations for attending today's program. I warmly welcome you at the online launch of the policy research on gender analysis of violent extremism and impact of COVID-19, peace and security in ASEAN. Allow me to also thank UN Women for publishing the report together with the National Counter-Terrorism Agency of Indonesia. My appreciation also goes to Gender Peace and Security Center at Monash University for their invaluable work in writing the report. This report was made under UN Women's project entitled Empowering Women for Sustainable Peace, Preventing Violence and Promoting Social Cohesion in ASEAN. Therefore, my appreciation also goes to the government of Canada and Republic of Korea for their generous support and contribution to the project. Distinguished participants, the project is published in a timely manner. First, it addresses the interlinked edge between women and violent extremism in the region and the spillover impact of the COVID-19. Second, it prescribes the course of action that government needs to take, such as develop policies based on a gender analysis of cause of the radicalization, recognize the multiplicity role of women in violence extremism, not only as a victims, but also as a sympathizer, recruiters, and perpetrators. Involve women and women groups in confronting violent extremism in their societies and develop counter narrative by promoting gender equality, including by lending women with credible voices. Third, it supports the implementation of the Bali PCRVE Works Plan 2019-2025, particularly in meeting one of its strategies to empower women and promote gender equality. Within the national context, the report support one of the main principles of the National Action Plan preventing counter-violent extremism, namely gender mainstreaming. For this reason, it is my fervent belief that mainstreaming gender is one of the best known ways to ensure government policies meet and address the unique needs of women, specifically to prevent violence against women and create peaceful communities where women can grow and live without fear. Distinguished participants, in conclusion, I'm proud to take part in this official launching of the report and gender analysis on violent extremism and impact of COVID-19 on peace and security ASEAN. Evidence-based research for policy. It is my hope that governments in the region will benefit from the recommendation made under the report. Indonesia has certainly taken benefit from such report. I thank you very much.
Thank you for the opening remarks, Excellency. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Diane Bryan, Head of Cooperation and Counselor, Global Affairs Canada, to deliver her remarks. Ms. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Distinguished participant, His Excellency Komjen Paul Dr. Boy Rafli Amar, Head of the National Counter-Terrorism Agency, Her Excellency Lenny Rosalind, Deputy Minister for Gender Equality, Ministry of Women, Empowerment and Child Protection, Mr. Jamshed Kazi, UN Women Representative and Liaison to ASEAN, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Selamat siang, good afternoon. I am pleased to join you today to the launch of the research gender analysis of violent extremism in the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN. The research is part of the project Empowering Women for Sustainable Peace, Preventing Violence and Promoting Social Cohesion in ASEAN, implemented by UN Women and funded by the Government of Canada and the Republic of Korea. In the last 2 years, we have witnessed how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted peace and security in the ASEAN region. It has tested all governments in the region, men and women, the most vulnerable, civil societies, and other peace builders. The pandemic has added another layer of risk and complexity to conflict and amplify inequalities between women and men, between countries, region, while also threatening and undermining human rights. Violent extremism is developed in diverse forms and shape across ASEAN, the ASEAN region. Preventing and countering violent extremism is essential to bring peace and empower women in the region. We know that inequality is a key driver of social unrest and conflict. Thus, peace and security for all can only be achieved and sustained if there is peace and security for women and girls. And the most effective way to achieve this is to provide women with equal opportunities, adequate protection, access to resources and services, and include them in decision-making processes. This policy research is very timely and an important contribution to the support of the implementation of the ASEAN Bali Work Plan 2019-2025. A number of key findings and recommendations from this research are critical to the implementation of policies on preventing and countering violent extremism. We look forward to ASEAN member states to include them in their national policies. Canada is proud to partner with ASEAN and to work together to create the key building blocks to promote women's rights and their empowerment, which are key to advance the ASEAN Women and Peace and Security agenda. To conclude, let me congratulate the Indonesian National Counter-Terrorism Agency, the Monash University, for the launch of the research and dedication to mainstreaming gender into prevention efforts of violent extremism and counterterrorism. I would also like to acknowledge UN Women for the technical assistance providing to ASEAN member states to produce evidence-based policies for the implementation of the WPS agenda in the region. I look forward to the presentations on the research and encourage participants to use the knowledge learned today into their work and make a difference. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Terima kasih. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Bryan, for your opening remarks. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Jamshed M. Kazi, UN Women Representative in Indonesia, and liaison to ASEAN to deliver his opening remarks.
His Excellency Bapak Komjen Pol Dr. Boy Rafli Amar, Her Excellency Ibu Leni Rosalind, Deputy Minister for Gender Equality, Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection, Ms. Diane Briand, Head of Cooperation and Counselor, Global Affairs Canada, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin by commending the National Counter-Terrorism Agency of Indonesia, BNPT, for the efforts towards mainstreaming gender to prevent violent extremism efforts. I would like to specifically thank His Excellency Bapak Komjen Pol Dr. Boy Rafli Amar for our strong partnership and for leading, along with his team, the production of the evidence-based policy research that we are launching today. The research that we are launching would not have been possible without the generous support from Global Affairs Canada and the Republic of Korea. I would like to particularly express my sincere appreciation and gratitude for the support rendered by GAC towards the advancement of Women, Peace and Security agenda in ASEAN. I would like to thank the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection of Indonesia for our partnership and collaboration in this policy research. Finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank the efforts of the Gender, Peace and Security Center at Monash University for conducting, along with UN Women, this interesting research. UN Women's close collaboration with all partners truly demonstrates the benefits of working together. It demonstrates that achieving desired and meaningful outcomes is only possible when cross-sectoral collaborations are leveraged. Excellencies and distinguished guests, we come together at a time when the world is facing unprecedented challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on peace and security across the globe, including in the ASEAN region. The ripple effects of the health crisis have undermined social cohesion and exacerbated intolerance and radicalization with a clear gendered impact, especially in conflict-affected countries. Indeed, the pandemic in and of itself is a threat to international peace and security. Our shared well-being and collective stability are under assault on many fronts. The COVID-19 crisis has reinforced pre-existing gender inequalities as shown by this research. Across Southeast Asia, reports of discrimination against marginalized groups are on the rise. The use of certain emergency and security responses has gendered impacts, and there is a risk of further backsliding the human rights of women and marginalized groups. Today, we come together at a crossroad between fragility and peace, disorder and integration, and between fear and hope. The WPS agenda has never been more relevant. It provides a framework for regional cooperation and country response to expand the connection between traditional and non-traditional security issues. It also helps to address key cross-border challenges. As part of the UN system, UN Women has been a strong partner of ASEAN in the journey to advance the WPS agenda since 2017. We remain committed to supporting ASEAN in the development of the Regional Plan of Action on Women, Peace and Security, and to producing evidence-based knowledge to inform the implementation of WPS-related policy frameworks. We strongly believe that the WPS approach to conflict prevention is complementary with the gender-responsive PVE strategies. As the ASEAN is currently working to develop the Regional Plan of Action on Women, Peace and Security, we need to ensure the synergy of efforts with the implementation of the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This report, therefore, is very timely, as there is a lot that we can learn and build on, especially the multi-sectoral collaboration between various ASEAN sectoral bodies to ensure peace and stability in the region. In the framework of this partnership with ASEAN and ASEAN member states, today we are jointly launching with BNPT a gender analysis of violent extremism and the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN. This research aims to show evidence and further inform the implementation of the ASEAN Bali Work Plan 2019 to 2025, which was developed to operationalize the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This report also identifies both persistent trends and changing gender dynamics of violent extremism in the COVID-19 context. Indeed, the policy research that we are launching today provides insights into how the COVID-19 pandemic has been successfully exploited by extremist groups to strengthen their organizations and intensify violent campaigns. In the current COVID-19 context, individuals are increasingly relying on social media and the internet to engage with extremist content. The research also indicates a growing concern among regional experts that violent extremist groups throughout Southeast Asia are espousing and transmitting violent messages online. Excellencies and distinguished guests, we strongly believe that the findings of this research, which will be presented by Monash University today, can help BNPT and policymakers in the ASEAN region to inform the implementation of countering terrorism policies and complement the effort to advance the WPS agenda in the region. I would like to conclude by encouraging the implementation of the recommendations drawn from this research. As UN Women, we continue to stand ready to support ASEAN sectoral bodies and ASEAN member states in integrating gender into the implementation of the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. We look forward to continuing our close partnership and cooperation with ASEAN and ASEAN member states towards achieving our shared goals so that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the openings. Now I would like to invite speakers for a photo session. Please kindly turn your camera on for the speakers. For dear participants, please kindly note you may not be able to turn your camera on as we are using Zoom webinar for this event. Thank you for your understanding. Okay, we're on. Let's take a picture. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you everyone. Distinguished guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen, now we will start the next session, presentation of key highlights and recommendations from the policy research, gender analysis of violent extremism and the impacts of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN. I would like to invite Dr. Alexandra Phelan, who is Deputy Director of the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Center and a lecturer in politics and international relations at Monash University. Her research team lead the research for the publication through interviews and surveys, and on behalf of her team, she will present key highlights and recommendations from the research. For participants who have questions, we have Q&A session after the 3 presentations. Please kindly raise your question during Q&A session or use the chat box. Now, I'd like to turn to Dr. Phelan. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good evening, Excellencies, distinguished guests and participants. My name is Dr. Alex Phelan, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Centre, who will be speaking a little bit about our research today on behalf of our research team. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, whose land many of us are situated on today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So our project examined how far and in what ways misogyny and hostile beliefs are fueling violent extremism throughout the Southeast Asian region, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. While a growing body of scholarship has identified the connection between gender norms, gender identity, gender ideology, and violent extremism, until recently, less research has addressed how misogyny and hostile sexist beliefs espoused online influence offline sites, which then in turn create very real insecurities for women and girls in particular. As a result, greater understanding of gender relations and roles and their importance for countering and preventing violent extremism is also needed beyond just understanding, for example, the role of women in high-profile attacks. So for our research, we engaged with 5 key research questions. The first is, what have been the key changing trends and dynamics of violent extremism in the context of COVID-19, including recruitment, propaganda, and or spread of misinformation and disinformation to fuel misogynist and hostile beliefs, both online and offline, to justify and legitimize violence against women in the ASEAN region. The second question was, to what degree do offline spaces reinforce hostile beliefs and misogyny towards women, potentially in turn further fueling violent extremism? Third, what are the points of contestation amongst women and men in communities affected by violent extremist groups throughout the region? How are women and men coping and or pushing back differently against these ideologies? What are the gender dynamics and what are the consequences of these? Fourth, we asked, what can we learn from the regional and national efforts in promoting and implementing PCVE in the member states? What have been key achievements and challenges, and what are the key policy recommendations and considerations for PCVE and security sector? Finally, how can gender perspectives be incorporated into policy and practices, including risk assessment, as well as the role of civil society and women's organisations in strengthening PCVE strategies throughout the ASEAN region? So I wanted to firstly talk a little bit about our significant findings, and then I'll go into our 6 recommendations that we derived from the project research. The first finding is that we found from our interviews and surveys that there was actually a consensus that online intolerant content is dangerous for women in the offline space, and that COVID has resulted in significant insecurities for women affected by violent extremism. We found that this was particularly exacerbated by stay-at-home orders and increased engagement in the online space throughout the pandemic period, as well as exposure to misinformation and disinformation regarding the pandemic itself. We know that generally online behaviour not only influences violent extremist roles, practices and recruitment, but can also result in insecurities in the offline space, including increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence. Our research indicates a growing concern that violent extremist groups throughout the region are espousing and transmitting violent messages online, including leveraging the COVID-19 pandemic through online propaganda to radicalise, recruit and mobilise group membership. The research indicates further a growing concern among regional experts that violent extremist groups throughout the Southeast Asian region are espousing and transmitting violent messages online. So as an example, 44% of expert respondents have recently viewed such messages always or very often when they were surveyed, including calls to violent jihad, which is incredibly worrying. Our second finding is that violent extremists are using propaganda and online messaging to espouse misogynistic and hostile views towards women. As examples, 67% of expert respondents said that they had seen this content sometimes, often, or very often, while 65% of experts had observed extremist social media content inciting violence towards women and girls. So that's quite significant. That's obviously over half of those that we interviewed and surveyed. We found that there were similarities in the ways in which violent extremist groups use propaganda and social media to recruit and radicalise women and men differently and espouse sexist views towards women. But responses from our interviews and surveys express that this can differ depending on the organisation itself, the geographical and geopolitical environment in which it operates, and the ideology that the extremist group espouses. So in this sense, misogyny and hostile beliefs towards women were found to play a key role in framing the narrative, participation, and the roles and duties of both women and men in extremist organisations throughout the region. As a result of this, it is important to consider that while organisations recruit and radicalise women and men quite differently, the gender norms that are prevalent within the espoused ideology of the group can influence processes in different ways, and therefore one must really begin to caution against a one-size-fits-all approach in PCVE policies and programming. Our third finding was that appeals to charismatic masculinities are used to attract recruits and legitimise violence, revealing a consistency between online and offline channels and sides of radicalisation and participation. But it's important to note that this really does differ depending on the ideology of the organisation, and it might not actually be consistent amongst different types of militant organisations throughout the region that can espouse different ideologies such as jihadism, ethno-nationalism, and even far-right extremism. Contestation amongst men and women in communities affected by violent extremist groups throughout the region does exist in pockets, with some evidence that women are beginning to push back against these misogynistic ideologies, including challenging narratives discursively through discussion forums and also challenging violent extremist ideology through appealing to moderation. So this is really positive that we're seeing women push back against these misogynistic ideologies. And then finally, we considered existing PCVE strategies and policies. So when drafting and implementing PCVE policies responsive to gender-sensitive approaches, intersectionality perspectives must be embedded and reflected in the substantive conversation of the draft of the policy, and meaningful participation must be included during the formulation of the policies. The multiplication of concrete NAP PCVE implementation initiatives at the local level, which signal multi-level coordination between national and local agencies, does allow for the broadening of ownership of PCVE as a shared agenda according to the violent extremist affected communities, which is important. Our study also interrogated what we can learn thus far from regional and national efforts in promoting and implementing PCVE in the member states, and what have been the key achievements and challenges, using specifically the Indonesian example as a case study. A key achievement amongst some member states, specifically in Indonesia and the Philippines, has been the commitment and implementation of national action plans on preventing and countering violent extremism. It's also evident that ASEAN member states have begun to respond to the need for gender responsive policies to PCVE programming and strategies, which is really important and positive. Despite, though, still an under-examination of the specific gender dynamics that play a key role in radicalisation, recruitment and participation. So some frameworks, such as the Philippines NAP, do recognise the importance of counter-narratives and the role of masculinities and femininities in framing experiences in violent extremism. However, it is also important to consider that women and men's engagement with both extremist content and also the organisations themselves differ. Now, when we conducted our survey and also conducted our interviews, participants were asked to reflect on how effective gender sensitive and gender responsive existing PCVE policies currently are, taking into account the concerns surrounding how violent extremism affects women and men distinctly, reflected in the study. Out of the sample, as an example, 46% of respondents agreed that existing prevention and countering violent extremism, so PCVE policies, reflect the diverse experiences of women and men in violent extremism, so just under half of participants. However, and I think this is quite important, only 26% of participants agreed that existing PCVE policies adequately address misogynistic and hostile beliefs espoused towards women by violent extremist groups. Importantly, 90% of respondents agreed that misogynistic and hostile views towards women espoused online by violent extremist groups pose a significant risk to women's security in the real world. So this is really important, and this is obviously important to consider when formulating PCVE policies. This is still a little bit of a gap according to our surveys and interviews, and some, and I guess an area which we hope that this report will be able to shed some ideas in terms of how to actually begin to think about this when responding to the consequences of these misogynistic ideologies. We hope that the findings of these studies can indeed inform current PCVE policies and programming throughout the region. More than half of the expert respondents agreed that the growth of online misogyny and hostile beliefs towards women in particular were not reflected in current PCVE policies. More PCVE policies should address the gender dimensions of increasing online radicalisation and its impact on both women and men's offline recruitment to violent extremism, paying particular attention to the differences in gender norms espoused in different ideologies throughout the region. And this is including ethno-nationalist, far-right, and also communist ideologies. So based on the research, we make 6 recommendations for PCVE policy and programming throughout the region. The first recommendation is that PCVE policy should be based on gender-sensitive analysis of the causes of individual radicalisation manifesting into violent extremism. This includes acknowledging that radicalisation processes and the drivers towards violent extremism can be distinct amongst women and men. So from our survey data and interviews, a common concern was often raised that policymakers must further acknowledge that radicalisation processes are distinct amongst women and men, despite recruitment and participation into the same organisation. So put simply, potential differences in drivers that influence women and men's radicalisation can not only be distinct, but also highly gendered. It's important to note, though, that women and men can obviously not be treated monolithically, but rather the factors that push men to join a violent extremist group might not be the same factors that push women to join the same violent extremist group. So as a result, risk assessment should incorporate male and female gender-specific radicalisation indicators, as well as indicators of misogyny and hostile beliefs and monitoring of them as related but distinct from broader conflict dynamics. I know this is not a surprise to many of us here, but violent extremism not only occurs in times of conflict, but also occurs in times of peace. Now, this involves identifying individuals, both men and women, with hostile sexist attitudes, which is different, though, than the presence of discriminatory gender norms in a group's ideology. as particularly at risk of conducting violence. And it is important that these are responsive to different ideologies throughout the region. Our second recommendation is that current PCVE policy should be informed by gender-sensitive analysis of all forms of extremism and violent extremism, and differentiate between ethno-nationalist extremism, far-right extremism, and communist insurgency, where religion is not a key dimension of the ideology. The ideologies of most violent extremists and terrorist organizations contain inherently gender dynamics, even ones that treat gender, well, that implement degrees of gender sameness, or at least rhetorically. The way in which violent extremist groups construct gender norms, including how groups can produce masculinities and gender norms that can either enable or limit women's participation, is not only important in understanding violence, but also the normalization of certain behaviours, both within the group and within areas of proto-state influence. For example, the construction of in-group gender norms can impact on the likelihood of women's violence being accepted as legitimate by these groups. It can impact on the roles imagined for women. It can impact on the behaviours normalised for men. And importantly, it can also impact on the treatment of perceived enemy women. Policymakers need to take into consideration national threat environments in the region and the ideologies of extremist organisations, and consider how they can actually appeal to women and men differently. Although jihadist violent extremism does continue to pose an enduring threat throughout the region, it is also important to consider that extremism and conflict posed by far-right, ethno-nationalist and communist groups and their respected strategies are different, and they are used to recruit and sustain the involvement of women and men very distinctly. Our third recommendation is the differential impacts of terrorism on women and girls should be integrated into PCVE policy and programming. It is important that policymakers consider their local context throughout the region and develop specific programs that focus on women and girls that specifically reflect how gender dynamics are playing a role in radicalisation, taking care not to perpetuate invalid gendered stereotypes that women are always victims or are somehow conned into joining violent extremist groups. This is particularly the case when thinking about the repatriation of former individuals who are actively or passively involved with ISIS and or living within their areas of proto-state influence. This includes considering that women and girls can simultaneously and at the same time be victims, perpetrators, supporters, influencers, and active participants in terrorist organisations, which then really necessitates a complex and nuanced understanding of the range of risk factors involved. It has further implications for online and offline dynamics, particularly heightened during the pandemic, where women's increased use of social media and engagement in group chats and forums, including women's only online forums, during stay-at-home orders did begin to expose women to incentives for joining violent extremist organisations. Furthermore, gender-sensitive e-training could be recommended for security and intelligence officers on how to identify hostile sexist attitudes online. Our fourth, oopsie daisy, apologies. Our fourth recommendation is that PCV programs should support the development of counter-narratives to violent extremism that foreground women's voices and experiences of misogyny, including those previously involved with extremist organisations and that actually promote gender equality in contrast to misogynistic narratives. Multiple participants identified in our study that violent extremist organisations throughout the region seek to delegitimise women as leaders specifically. Women's voices and counter-narratives to violent extremism, though, should actually be amplified by leaders in the communities, civil societies, organisations and government, including integration into support and referral initiatives and digital gender-sensitive e-safety training, At the same time, policymakers must acknowledge that counter-narratives can also have the potential to indirectly victimise or create vulnerabilities for women. Policymakers and leaders do not just amplify women's voices and counter-narratives, but they themselves and their organisations can actually be role models in challenging hostile sexist attitudes. As a result, it's absolutely crucial that policymakers engage women's civil society organisations and women's groups in devising these counter-narratives as they often have extensive knowledge in understanding local grievances that can serve as drivers towards violent extremism and offer alternative pathways at the local level. Excuse me. Apologies. Our fifth recommendation is that policymakers should listen to and involve communities in which violent extremist groups exist. It's important to engage women and civil society organisations that are already at the forefront of violent extremist activity, who understand the local context, they have local contacts, and they understand the real and perceived grievances at the local level. Existing PCVE strategies throughout the region do tend to be quite general, where our research found the need for those to not only be more specific to the gendered experiences of women and men, but also to the diverse extremist ideologies and the specific environments in which they exist. Grassroots peace-building initiatives and organisations can really play a key role in the PCVE space and provide the opportunity to bridge the gap between government and policymakers and local communities. Indeed, and as we outline in the report, this can simultaneously contribute to higher accountability for government agencies and ministries, including the incorporation of gender mainstreaming, and potentially then in turn decrease the vulnerability of communities at risk. And then finally, excuse me, the formulation of NAP PCVEs can be highly institutionalized, but they don't necessarily have to be rigid. This can be a participatory process with engagement not only coming from ministerial organisations, but also civil society organisations. The formulation of PCVE plans that connect to national WPS frameworks is crucial to addressing misogyny dynamics and the attraction of violent extremism, especially the sexist attitudes and the socially constructed masculinities and femininities that provide fertile ground for radicalisation towards violence. Our case study of Indonesia's NAP PCVE drafting and ongoing implementation can provide lessons learned that might be beneficial in informing other national action plans throughout the region. As identified, the multiplicity of NAP PCVE implementation initiatives at the local level, as a result of multi-level coordination between local and national agencies, allows for the broadening of ownership of PCVE as a shared agenda between government and grassroots levels. Policymakers need to ensure that intersectionality and the inclusion of diverse perspective in the drafting of NAP PCVEs, and there must be concrete efforts to ensure the recognition and accommodation of civil society representativeness, voices, experiences, and contributions in the drafting process itself. This then contributes to meaningful participation and facilitates opportunities to discuss and debate key concepts, including gender, which are really crucial to enhancing the success of PCVE strategies and tailoring PCVE policies. Again, apologies. So on behalf of Monash GPS, I would like to thank BNPT, Indonesia's Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection, and also UN Women for giving us the opportunity to carry out this really timely and important research, and also thank the governments of Canada and Korea for their contributions. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can in the Q&A box after we finish the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fallon, for your comprehensive presentation. Building on the highlights and recommendations shared by Dr. Fallon, we will now move on to the next session on the implementation of the ASEAN Bali Work Plan 2019 to 2025, reflection on the recommendations from the study and way forward. I would like to invite our first speaker, Bapak Andika Krishna Yudanto, the Deputy Head of National Counter-Terrorism Agency of Indonesia, or BNPT. Bapak Andika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ibu Sarah. Allow me to share my screen. Right. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting BNPT to this very important online launch of the policy research, gender analysis of violent extremism and the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN. Firstly, allow me to greet Ibu Leni and Rosalyn, Deputy for Gender Equality, Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection of Indonesia, also as the current chair of the ASEAN ACW. Ms. Diane Bryan, Head of Cooperation and Counselor, Global Affairs Canada, Mr. Jamsit M. Kazi, Representative and Liaison to ASEAN, UN Women Indonesia, and of course, Dr. Alexandra Pellan, Deputy Director of the Gender, Peace and Security Center and lecturer in politics and international relations at the Monash University. Again, it's certainly an honor for BNPT to look into seeing how the implementation of the Bali Work Plan 2019 to 2025, and of course, what are the reflections on the recommendations from the study and the way forward. Having said that, looking into the global, regional, and national context of how of women and that are interlinked with violent extremism. One such report is coming in from the CTED, or the Counter-Terrorism Executive Director, when they're looking into the gender dimension of response to returning foreign terrorist fighters in 2019. We're seeing that, of course, there's a lot of males are traveling to Syria and Iraq, around 37 to 41,000, whereas only 13% of foreign female are associated with ISIS, that around 4,000 to 4,700 females, women are traveling to Iraq and Syria, whereas 12% of foreign minors are traveling to Iraq and Syria to join with ISIS. But if you're looking at the return of male, men, female, and children, only the small percentage is linked to female that are returning to their countries of origin, which is only 4%, whereas 79% are male returnees, and whereas 17% are minor returnees from Iraq and Syria. So again, this is a number that we're looking into, that there is a difference between male and female when it comes to even when we're looking into the return of foreign terrorist fighters to their countries of origin. Now, in 2021, in June, the Sufan Center came out with a research entitled Terrorism and Counter-Terrorism in Southeast Asia, Emerging Trends and Dynamics. There are three worrying trends in the region: the possibility of terrorists still utilizing suicide bombings as the main terrorist tactics. Second is that there is a growing that the terrorist landscape in Southeast Asia has witnessed a growing role of women as perpetrators of terrorist violence, a trend that is always likely to continue. And of course, the third is the worrying sign is the acceleration of the process of radicalization from years to months, and then it's also attributed to online self-radicalization and paving way for lone wolf attacks. So these are some of the worrying trends in the region, where one of them is that there is a growing role of women as perpetrators of terrorist violence, and that is likely to continue as a trend. Now, at the national level, BNPT has conducted a survey that is conducted by the Coordinating Forum for the Prevention of Terrorism, located in 32 provinces in Indonesia. And this particular survey found that young women face a greater risk of radicalization rather than their male peers, and that the impact of radicalization was high among Generation Z, millennials, and the urban youth during the pandemic. So these are some of the trends that we are seeing at the global level, regional level, as well as national level. And that is why I think in 2019, the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime adopted the Bali Work Plan 2019 to 2025, where this was an implementation work plan for the ASEAN Plan of Action on the prevention and encountering the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This Bali Work Plan has around 100 activities, and some of it also has it is one of the largest cross-sectoral and cross-pillar collaboration within ASEAN. It has 19 sectoral bodies, entities, and organs of ASEAN that are working to implement the Bali Work Plan. The gender-related issues is being spearheaded by the ACW and the ACWC, and it's the largest commitment to synergize cross-sectoral and cross-pillar approach. Its work is focused on the priority area 1.5, which is to empower women and promote gender equality to enhance the capacity, participation, and leadership of women in the promotion of moderation and tolerance to prevent the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. And it has four main areas that is led by the ACW and ACWC. It is also supported by a number of sectoral bodies within ASEAN and also organs and entities, which is the Senior Officials Meeting on Education, the Senior Officials Meeting on Culture, and also the Senior Officials Meeting on Youth, and also the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Now, this is something, it's a cross-pillar, cross-sectoral approach led by the ACW and ACWC. Of course, the report will then be reported by the SOMTC. It has four relevant focus areas of activities to promote gender equality and empower women to address local grievances and to alter radical narratives, especially among vulnerable communities. Activities to identify paths to violence taken by radicalized families and women. Activities to encourage supporting systems for women on civic and moderate religious values. And the fourth is from activities to promote gender mainstreaming on prevention and countering the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. The research that was conducted by Monash and of course welcomed by BNPT, it has quite an important finding that the pandemic has been successful in exploiting extremist actors to strengthen their organization and intensify violent campaigns. The findings also saw that violent extremists are using propaganda and online messaging to espouse misogynistic as well as hostile views towards women. And appeals to charismatic masculinities are used to attract recruits and legitimize violence, revealing consistency between online and offline channels, sites of radicalization and participation. PCVE policies responsive to gender-sensitive approaches, intersectional perspective must be embedded or to reflect in the substantive conversation of the draft, and meaningful participation must be included during the formulation of policies, including national action plans. It has, I think the recommendations has been mentioned by Dr. Alexander Fellan, but just some important recommendations that we see that any sort of policies should be based on gender-sensitive analysis of causes of individuals' radicalization, which transform itself into violent extremism. There is also there is differential impacts of terrorism on women and girls and should be integrated on PCVE policy and programming. The PCV program should be supported in the development of counter-narrative through violent extremism that places women's voices and experiences of misogyny in the foreground. And again, the formulation of the National Action Plan or PCV can be highly institutionalized, but not necessarily rigid. So this is, I think, an important element where, for example, for Indonesia, the National Action Plan is a living document. For the reflection and way forward, we find that the key findings of the research are relevant to the challenges and dynamics of the multiplicity roles of women in violent extremism in the region, particularly in the context of the pandemic. And the way forward is that we encourage the ACW and also the ACWC as the lead sectoral bodies on activities related to women empowerment and promote gender equality to fully commit on the implementation of the related activities of the Bali Work Plan 2019 to 2025. Also, the recommendations can be taken into account for consideration by policymakers and other relevant stakeholders in developing their own national action plans on PCVE. And I think one of the most important things is that good practices such as involvement of civil society organizations in developing PCV policy and programming at the national level can be a reference for countries in the region in developing their own national action plans on PCV. So having said that, I think these are some of the reflections and the way forward that we can take from the research that has been conducted by Monash, particularly related to the gender analysis of violent extremism and the impact of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN. Without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Andika, for the presentation. Now, I would like to invite our second speaker, Her Excellency Ibu Leni and Rosalind, SA, MSc, MPhil, the Deputy Minister for Gender Equality, Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection of Indonesia, and the Chair of the ASEAN Committee on Women. Ibu Leni, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. His Excellency Bapak Boy Rafli, the head of BNPT, Honorable Ms. Diana Brand, head of Cooperation and Global Affairs of Canada, also Honorable Mr. Jamsit, representative of ASEAN. This is from UN Women Indonesia, Bapak Andika, and also Bapak Andika, the Deputy for International Cooperation of BNPT, and of course, Ibu Dr. Alexandra Filan from Monash University. Honorable speakers, all participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and good afternoon from Jakarta. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me share the screen for you here. Listening to the result of the study presented by Ms. Alexandra, and also listening what have already mentioned by Pak Boy Rafli, head of BNPT, as well as Ibu Diana on the opening remarks, and Bapak Jamsit, and the last one, followed by the presentation from Pak Andika from BNPT. I would like to share here on behalf of ACW, ASEAN Committee on Women, related to the ASEAN Bali Work Plan 2019-2025, responded to the result of this launch. But before that, I would like to share a bit on the what's have been done and what are we going to do in the near future. And here there are some notes, that we have to consider, that there are ASEAN high-level political commitment to prevent violent extremism, which have already started 2015, which is all ASEAN leaders adopted Langkawi Declaration on the Global Movement of Moderates in 2015 here, At least there are 5 points that all leaders would like to respond to their countries. And also there's the Manila Declaration to counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This one adopted by the ASEAN Ministers meeting on transnational crime in 2017. So the next one is that all ASEAN Political Security Community Blueprint 2025 here also envisions a community that fully respects the different religions, blah, blah, blah. And then this one upholds common values in the spirit of unity in the diversity, as well as address the threat of violent extremism in all its forms and manifestations. It is the summary of the Blueprint 2025. And Chairman's statement of the 37th ASEAN Summit in last 2 years, November in Vietnam, the leaders remain steadfast in their commitment to combat terrorism, radicalization, violent extremism, and transnational crimes, particularly amidst the challenges and new threats posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, including by strengthening cross-sectoral and cross-pillar cooperation. I think this is very comprehensive, the the chairman's statement here. And also in the following year, in last year in Brunei Darussalam, in the 38th and 39th ASEAN Summit, the leaders also stressed the importance for the full and effective implementation of the work plan on the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This is linked to the Bali Work Plan 2019-2025, which is we all are going to address the threat of radicalization and violent extremism in the region in a holistic and inclusive manner, with the involvement of a broader range of stakeholders, including women and youth. So I think this is very relevant to the findings of the research itself, as already presented by Ms. Alexandra from Monash University. And also, this is also linked to what have already presented by Pak Andika, yeah, that's for the way forward. We have to encourage ACW and ACWC as lead sectoral bodies. Yeah, so I think I will explain later on that point. ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent, counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. This one adopted at the 12th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime last 2018. It's already mentioned by head of BNPT, Pak Boy, yeah. And then this plan of action charts a course for action among ASEAN's institutions and to further strengthen the close cooperation among member states in preventing and countering the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. And also this ASEAN Plan of Action also guide relevant ASEAN sectoral bodies, organs, and entities in carrying out the necessary activities and monitor effectiveness in preventing and countering radicalization and violent extremism. We know from the documents, the plan of action itself, that there are 4 strategies that we are going to use. We use, yeah, to implement this ASEAN Plan of Action. The first strategy is related to the comprehensive and broad activities tailored to address localized and context-specific factors. This is also linked to the reflections that presented by Bapak Andika before, yeah, and then also evidence-based, data-driven, yeah, and the last one is reach out across many sectors, yeah. So these strategies also linked to what the result from the study presented by Ms. Alexandra. Here is the ASEAN Plan of Action. Yeah, I think some of it for some of these objective and priority areas have been presented by Bapak Andika. And I would like to underline here that there are objectives. There are 7 objectives, yeah, of this ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremisms. And among other, if you see here, related to gender issues is the 5th one, yeah, empowering women and promoting gender equality. But if we look at the 4th one, empowering youth, this is a link to what the findings of the study and also the underlying issues raised by Bapak Andika, that based on the results of the study done by BNPT in 2020, that the impact was high, particularly among Generation Z and millennials, as well as urban youth during the pandemic. So, and it also, the survey underlined that young women face a greater risk of radicalization rather than their male peers. So this is really important that this ASEAN Plan of Action also have to reach this by empowering youth more and more in the future. And also this ASEAN Plan of Action have 4 priority areas, yeah. So let me explain one by one. The first one is 1.5. Pak Andi have already presented also, but I would like to add with some points here that based on the priority areas, empower women and promote gender equality to enhance the capacity, participation, and leadership of women in the promotion of moderation and tolerance to prevent the rise of the radicalization and violence extremisms. Under this priority areas 1.5, there are actually at least 5 indicative activities that SCW will lead initiatives. Yeah, so mainstream gender perspectives in all initiatives as a means of preventing violence extremism through capacity building initiatives, and also invest in gender sensitive research and data collection in order to develop evidence-based responses. A third one, nurture the capacity of women and civil society groups to engage in prevention of violent extremism and related response efforts, and ensure allocation of funds to for resultant initiatives through training and or workshop activities. The fourth one is build a gender-sensitive strategy of development addressed to enhance good governance, combat radical ideology, and promote the role of women as agents for peace. And the last one is activities to promote gender mainstreaming on preventing and countering the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. So, ladies and gentlemen, actually related to this priority areas in order to empower women and promote gender equality. Now I'm as the Deputy Minister for Gender Equality in the Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection of the Republic of Indonesia. I think by the end of this week, ya Pak Andika, ya, we would like to discuss about the memorandum of understandings between our ministers, yeah, between our ministers and the head of BNPT, ya, related to the, jadi nota kesepahaman, ya, we call nota kesepahaman, related to the how to boost the implementation of gender mainstreaming and women empowerment and protection, yeah, and children to prevent and to counter extremism, based violence based, you know, that will lead to the terrorism. Yeah. So I think the discussion will be start soon, and we have already had the draft here, ya, Pak Andika, ya, and I think Indonesia could take some actions because the study from BNPT in 2020 is very rich and with the result, yeah, and then we can use that the result of the study and combine with the study from the Monash University, I think, to answer what a CW-led initiative but implemented in Indonesia, then we can refer to some points here. And of course, talking about this specific issue, yeah, how the challenge is also how we improve the capacity, the participation, and leadership of women. Yeah, this is very critical because we have almost 50% of our total population is women. Yeah, actually 49.5% women, and they are almost 60% in productive age. Yeah, so this is very critical, and that's why we have to improve their capacity, their participation, as well as their leadership. And I think hopefully by having a joint agreement between our ministry with the BNPT, that will lead to the prevention of the rise of radicalization and violent extremism among women and children in Indonesia. Let me continue with SCW-led initiatives. If this is this slide show for 1.5, the next slide show for 1.2. Yeah, strengthen good governance, human rights, and the rule of law to prevent the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. Actually, gender-related initiatives here that some of them are done, but the other one are in the process that we are going to have indicative activities here that create fair working conditions for workers, including migrant workers, especially women, as means to prevent them from being radicalized. And also activities that create more favorable conditions based on human rights principles and existing domestic laws on the of the countries for refugees and stateless people, especially women, as means to prevent them from being radicalized. So these are two indicative activities related to the initiatives that ACW does. Yeah. So related to the priority areas 1.8, that we have to strengthen the strategic communications, including through the internet and social media, to prevent their misuse by radicals and extremism proponents to pursue violence, extremist activities, and promote extreme ideologies. And this is true, and what I've already presented by Alexandra from Monash University, based on the result of the study, we can see that there are some loops that we have to do to prevent the misuse of this internet and social media. And during pandemic, women, children, all people, I think, use internet and social media very high tension. So I think we have to do something to prevent the misuse of this by radicals and extremist proponents. Yeah. So the ACW gender-related initiatives, we have one indicative activities, which is activities to build social media resilience amongst vulnerable groups. And I think we can include, and have a joint activities with SCWC, because to cover the Generation Z and millennials as well as urban youths, as found by the study of BNPT in 2020. Then, of course, the point is, again, on preventing the misuse of social media for violent extremism, including activities related to awareness raising among personalities or influencers from other forms of media, since they also play an important role in countering violence extremism. Yeah. So based on these three objectives, actually SCW responded to number 5. That's the most important one, and then the number 2, 1.2, and 1.8. So there are three linked to the three objectives of this ASEAN Plan of Action. Okay, so the last one, moving forward, ACW under the multi-sectoral task force, we are working on the initial composition of the task force, include ASEAN sectoral bodies, organs, and entities. And I think we have to discuss with all those sectoral bodies, organs, and entities in ASEAN. And then there will be the second ASEAN partners meeting on the implementation of the Bali Work Plan that will be tentatively held in next month, this year. And hopefully the issues and the findings or the recommendation from the study done by Monash University, I think we can put it as a part of the agenda, and also other, probably from other resources that can enrich our actions to move forward to counter this to violent extremism, and especially how to see the impact, the gender impact, of COVID-19 on peace and security in ASEAN countries. I think those are the things that I would like to share this afternoon. And thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Leni, for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now on questions and answers session. I'd like to invite Ms. Rais Chanchai, ASEAN Governance, Peace and Security Specialist and Regional Project Lead of UN Women Indonesia, to moderate the Q&A session. Please rise.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunities to moderate this Q&A session. I would like to encourage participants to leave their questions and comments, if possible, on the Q&A channel, so that we can make sure that we can see them adequately. But in any case, if anyone leaves the question in the chat box, I think we'll try to make sure that we'll address them. If anyone would like to speak and interact with the panel speaker directly, please raise your hands and we will give you the floor and a chance to moderate, to actually ask the questions at this moment.
Ms. Wright, I think we already have one question. Maybe
Okay, we have one. I think we have one question in the chat box. Is that right? How does the research distinguish the violent extremist actors from the regular conservative groups in the online platform? This is one question that just came up. Maybe I invite Professor Alexandra to respond to this question. Over to you.
That's a really great question, Rice, and thank you. I think that one big factor that can potentially distinguish violent extremist groups from more conservative ideology or more extreme or radical ideology is the endorsement of violence as legitimate. I think this is a really important point, and particularly when looking then at misogynistic views and hostile beliefs towards women. When these groups overtly espouse that engaging in gender-based violence, sexual violence, specifically targeting women because of the ideology of the movement, so threatening the use of violence or actually using the threat of violence or using violence, this really distinguishes violent extremist groups from conservative, extreme, or radical actors. So this is how we approach the differentiation in the project. And again, you know, throughout the region, one of the big things or the big, I guess, points of feedback that we were definitely getting from our respondents and the experts that we were interviewing is that this is not necessarily just about jihadism, right? It's also about far-right extremism that's starting to emerge throughout the region. Continued groups that more adhere to ethno-nationalist ideologies as well. And also even communist insurgency is a little bit different because although the ideologies are quite gendered, it's a little bit different to other groups that are more patriarchal and deliberately target women violently. But it is, again, that legitimization of violence as being a tactic that should be used in pursuit of ideology. Thank you, Rice. I hope that was helpful.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much. While we're waiting for further questions on the Q&A, perhaps at this juncture, it might be helpful, Professor Alexandra, to perhaps if possible for you to clarify a little bit what do you see as a potential link between rising conservatism and these correlations perhaps with misogyny and radicalization and extremism based on the research. Perhaps maybe some insights. I know that that's not exactly the key focus of the research, but I think just while we wait for participant to come in, I wonder if you have any insight on that.
Great question, Rice. And I mean, this is something that here at Monash GPS, we are actually examining in a variety of different contexts, not just within the ASEAN region. We've seen this, we've seen a trend in Latin America. We've also seen trends amongst the far right and the radical right, even here in Australia, where you have populist conservative actors that can be seen as, you know, more on the right, become normalized and begin to, you know, fill public spaces. And what this can potentially do is legitimize the ideology and legitimize the identity of more extremist actors. Then they actually become more radical because they can use this narrative and use this discourse to actually take this further. So in the context of the countries that we studied, this was a point that was raised. There seemed to be a humble concern, not in terms of violent extremism, but potentially in Malaysia, that there seemed to be a rise of conservatism that some experts were becoming a little bit worried about. And also, interestingly, according to some of the experts we interviewed, that women themselves were espousing anti-feminist ideology too, especially those in leadership positions. So we need to be mindful of this. And this is one of the big points that we raised in the report, that violent extremism doesn't just occur in conflict. It also occurs in times of peace. It occurs, where there are fractions within society, where there are divides within society. And sometimes the more the more polarized these are, it can give rise to reciprocal radicalization and for more extreme groups to utilize violence to achieve their aims. So this is a general trend. It's something that was identified by some respondents in the report. But, I do think that this has as well important policy implications. And again, it's one of the reasons why we're agitating that when we begin to think about the implementation of gender in the incorporation of gender in PCVE policies, that one doesn't adopt this one-size-fits-all model. This is so important, particularly because gender ideology, gender norms, and the ways that groups actually target women and men is very different. So this is our humble suggestion, and hopefully that our checklist in the report might be helpful to begin to think about how to actually implement this in strategy.
Thank you so much. I have now seen the hands up from Pak Taba. If I may request the organizer to unmute Pak Taba to be able to speak up and share his comments or questions. Over to you, Pak Taba.
Hello, is my voice clear?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you, Rice. I would like to raise a question for Professor Alexandra. This is maybe the other side of the pandemic. You know that this pandemic also create, limit the mobilization of men and women. So when for example, in normal life, they will consolidate more frequent than in the pandemic. So it assumes that the process of radicalization is more intensive when in the normal life than in the pandemic life. Do you find any, the consequence of this pandemic on this type of ideologization or maybe recruitment process in the offline life? Because we know that the limitation of movement and the restriction of social movement quite obvious. And the second question is, I think on the online level, when you mentioned that this is quite encouraging for the ideologues to expand their radicalization methods. How about the other side of the effort to prevent those actions? How is it higher than before before the pandemic, or how it mutated or it transformed in the pandemic life? Thank you.
No, thank you. They are fantastic questions. I've scribbled some notes down as you were talking, so I will approach both questions. But please, if I miss something out, feel free to reiterate the question. Regarding the first point, in terms of differences, I guess, in COVID-19 that was quite striking. I think that one point that is under-examined, not just in the context of ASEAN, but also in other regions as well, but it did come up in this particular project, is the importance of men's only and women's only online groups. So this can be online forums, it can be within Facebook group chats, it can be within WhatsApp. And, you know, especially with stay-at-home orders that are prevalent and were prevalent throughout the pandemic, inevitably this meant that, you know, everyone was engaging more online. Everyone was connecting via Telegram, WhatsApp, Viber, whatever messaging app one prefers. And this was a way to connect with friends and to provide support networks, right? I'm sure we all had our own support networks. I definitely did amongst some colleagues of mine overseas. And this is the key point, right? The great thing about WhatsApp and Viber, as we all know, is that it does provide these connections to be able to form these groups to talk to people overseas. Now, leading on to this point, you know, sort of utilizing these mechanisms online during COVID creates these safe space, which allow individuals to be able to talk about the everyday and everyday practices. And what we've seen is that, you know, with some ISIS-inspired groups, there are indeed women's only forums where women are joining these organizations. And of course, they're not necessarily radicalized at this time or necessarily endorse violence or believe that violence is a legitimate tactic to pursue a political goal or aim. But rather when they join these groups, there is a discussion. And, you know, it takes time and it takes trust building, but incentives are provided to women to encourage them or get them thinking about, you know, the benefits of becoming involved in a violent extremist organization. Now, the same thing happens with men, but I think this has definitely always occurred, of course, but I think because of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders, this is something that there has been a shift and an enhancement of activity because of this very reason. Now, of course, this inevitably does have implications for the offline space. There were a couple of anecdotal examples that were provided in some of the interviews where participants had directly seen that, you know, marriage proposals, incentives that, you know, if a woman was to go and marry so-and-so that was involved in ISIS, that there would be great and positive everyday incentives and things for her that were great, essentially. And particularly in the context of COVID, where everyone has been struggling, you know, this can indeed provide a motivating or a push factor. Now, regarding your second point, which is the other side, the efforts to prevent, what is currently being done. I think as our report identifies, we did, my wonderful colleagues, Irini Giatri and Dr. Ampon Martin actually were responsible for conducting interviews, of course, online, but with their contacts in Indonesia and also within southern Thailand. And, you know, it is interesting in some of these cases that there have been active efforts during this time of women's local organisations, civil societies organisations pushing back by challenging the narratives, by challenging the discourses. And of course, definitely, you know, there are complications in this insofar that, you know, during lockdown, we're not able to do this in person and the online domain becomes particularly relevant. Admittedly, I think that this is actually going to be a challenge in post-COVID recovery, insofar the fact that this online dimension is so pressing. And I'm so happy that Her Excellency Rosalind was bringing up this point pertaining to stratcoms. This is something we do a lot of work on here at GPS in other areas, but the importance of strategic communications, not only providing counter narratives, but providing other options out in terms of, you know, inspirational leaders, definitely discourse and narratives, but then other options and utilizing strategic communications in the social media space specifically is going to be so important going into this next phase of post-COVID recovery, in my humble opinion. As a comparison, we're working on a project that is actually looking at the effects of this in the far-right organisations and the transmission of violent beliefs between the UK and Australia. And of course, what we're finding, again, as we were speaking about, is that in these group chats, it's really hard to break the narrative. So strategic communications is going to be absolutely key. And this is something that we're really excited about, that there will be a priority area in this space.
Thank you so much. I have now seen another questions. I think it's direct to you and women in the chat box. So the Ibu Yolanda asked us to talk about progress. What activity did you and women do for young people, especially women, to be more sensitive to these issues? And how does you and women embrace young people who are very influential figures in the future? I was just gonna try to be very brief here. There's a lot of things that we're doing at the global, regional, and country level in terms of engagement with youth. As you may know, in the last year when we celebrated this Beijing Platform for Action, I think one of the biggest thematic areas that we focus is generation equality, and really the focus is to engage young people, not only young women but young men, because we do believe that social norm change for gender equality does take time, and it really takes a new generation to value that gender equality is not only benefit women, but it actually benefit everyone in the society when we actually have a society that is respectful of people with a diverse identity, with diverse gender identities. And it's not just women, right, that we're talking about in this case. I think there's also the diversity within women that we actually need to highlight. So I think that's a broad stroke of our engagement and support of young people in the space of PVE and in the space of WPS. I think it's a very contentious space, and perhaps in the context of Indonesia specifically, we have actually partnered with AMAN, and in these recent efforts, I think we have done a lot to link the issues of youth peace and security with women peace and security. We have formulated together with AMAN quite a few mentoring and youth camps that bring young leaders together into sharing the ideas. There's like a Youth Peace Academy. There's also a training and coaching on the leadership, especially for young women, but also to use and harness technologies and creativity to develop counter narrative. And I think one thing that we've been talking about within the team, myself and the team, is to actually follow our youth leaders that actually have a lot of impressive profiles. It's unbelievable how creative and how motivated these young people are, especially young women in the context of Indonesia in particular, that we have been recently engaged. That we wanted to follow them and actually, if possible, come up with the stories of what they have learned from these capacity building youth camps and this exchange and building bonds with other young leaders and going back to the communities, and how does it help them in actually advancing their participation in the community, in leadership, in addressing social cohesion and peaceful society, so that we can have more of this inspiring story to follow through and share with the larger community, not only Indonesia but in the wider region. There are also some work that has been currently ongoing. I think linking to the peace villages. I think there are some of our colleagues from Wahid Foundation, Pataba, and a few others are here, that we're looking into linking the work with UNDP in terms of youth engagements, in terms of in education setting, and engaging young women more, because I think there's a tendency to the narrative to be lost when it comes to youth peace and security. The gender aspect is lost again. So I think that's something that we've been doing. I hope that satisfies the question. I don't see any more question, but we're also running slightly over time. I think that at this moment, perhaps I think we have shared a lot of information at this session today, and we really are grateful for all the esteemed panelists and the speakers and the launch that captures some really critical recommendation that we could take forward in our policy and program intervention. I really, really appreciate the participation of the wide range of participants. I know that there's a broader partner and donor communities are here as well. So I hope that we will continue to partner in this endeavor, in these efforts to also go beyond the leadership of Indonesia in the region also to engage and share experience across the region, because we do have a very rich knowledge and good practices that already exist in the region that can be expanded and replicated. So I've sort of culminate the session together with my moderation now into closing. So thank you very much, Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts and your view, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you in taking some of these recommendations and the research into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rice.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. We have a housekeeping
Thank
reminder, right,
Yeah,
for
thank
participants.
Thank you, Rice. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Buleni.
Thank you.
Before you leave, we're waiting for it's already there. So we hope today's session was useful for you and help you to understand the changing context of violent extremism across the ASEAN region during COVID-19. The report can be found on UN Women website. Our team will also send the link via chat box and also through email after the event. Thank you once again and have a pleasant rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sarah pindah ya? Bu Sarah pindah sekarang?
Iya Pak, saya di UN Women sekarang. Ketemu lagi.
Pindah ke UNPT dong.
NPT laki-laki semua Pak.
Makanya kita perlu women. Kita ajak Bu Sarah.
Lagi semua aku.
Udah berapa lama?
Baru Pak.
Oke. Bu Sarah makasih banyak ya.
Sama-sama
See
Pak.
you.